All right, today we're going to talk about the EM algorithm with specific application to the Gaussian mixture model. All right, so remember a Gaussian mixture model, we have components from which our data points are drawn, and each component has a probability, which we designate with pi, and then each component has associated with it a probability distribution, or density in this case. We have a different Gaussian density associated with each of 3 components, and each of these components would have a probability of generating a point. So the generative model description that we're dealing with in Gaussian mixture models is first we draw a variable z, which is the cluster assignment or component assignment from, have you guys heard of the categorical distribution? It's like the Bernoulli distribution is either 0 or 1. Categorical distribution is one of k categories. It's like picking a number from 1 to k. It's related to the multinomial distribution, but the multinomial distribution is if you chose n draws from a categorical distribution and you counted up how many of each type of number from 1 to k you got. Okay, so certainly categorical and multinomial are related. So we choose a cluster assignment, z, from the categorical distribution, and then we draw a point x from the density associated with cluster z. Okay? So that's how we generate our data points x. Is that clear? Questions? Okay, good. So that's the generative model, and we can put that together into a joint distribution for a pair x and z, where of course x is observed, but z will generally not be observed. And this is simply definition of conditional probability. But now let's plug in our conditional distribution of x given z, that's that Gaussian, and then pi z, that's our probability of cluster z. Okay? So that's our joint, but what we really need to work with is the marginal distribution for the data that we observe, which is x. We only observe x, we don't observe z. So we can get a density for x, a distribution for x, simply, what do? It's very easy. Yeah, right, we sum out over z, which we don't observe, that's marginalization, like this. Right? We take the joint, we sum out over z, we get p of x, and then of course we could just substitute in our expression for the joint, like that. So this is our marginal distribution for a single x. Great. So one way to estimate the parameters of the Gaussian mixture model is with maximum likelihood. I mentioned yesterday that there's a method of moments approach also, which is turning out to be very nice, and you can learn about that in a second class, Sontag's class, I think. Okay, but we're doing maximum likelihood here. So we're going to write down the likelihood of the data we observe and figure out which parameters maximize that likelihood. So here's the expression for the likelihood. It's trivial now because we have the likelihood for p of x. We did it on the previous slide. We have n data points, x1 through xn drawn IID. So to get the likelihood of the whole data set, trivial. We just multiply the likelihoods of the individual points, like that. Okay. All right, in the usual way, we want to look at the log likelihood. We usually think it's going to be easier to work with, so we take the log of PD. I'm calling, this is going to be our objective function, our log likelihood objective function. So now I'm writing it j, and the parameters of the objective function are the parameters of the model that we want to discover, that we want to maximize over in maximum likelihood. So when we take the log of p of d, the log moves nicely inside. Can you guys see my hand? Is this helpful? Yep. All right, good. So we take the log of this product, becomes the sum of the logs, and we get sum of the logs. And then we wish we could have this log interacting with the Gaussian distribution, because the Gaussian distribution has this leading exponentiation, and the log and the x cancel nicely, but the sum blocks the log. And this is what makes maximizing this a little bit difficult. Okay. So this is what we're going to maximize j using the EM algorithm. That's our motivation for EM. Okay. Any questions on this setup? This is just a review. Very good. Okay. So a little more review. Remember this thing we talked about yesterday, gamma IC. This is, we're calling yesterday the responsibility of cluster C for the point xi. I would prefer to just think of it as, for xi, what's the probability we think that it's in cluster C? So that's gamma IC. The vector of the gammas across all clusters is like a soft cluster assignment for a data point. And then the n sub c was, let's call this now the expected number of points in cluster C. So I remember I said the probability and expectation were kind of interchangeable. I just thought I'd work that out for you since I got some uncertain stares last time. So let's define n sub c as the expected number of points in cluster C for the data that we see. So expectation of the sum, indicator of zi equals c. So if the cluster for xi, which is zi, is equal to c, then this expression is 1, otherwise it's 0. We're adding up across all data points how many zi's are equal to c. So if this is a random variable, if we knew what it was, that would be the number of points that are actually from cluster C. But we don't observe this, but we can take the expectation of that with this condition on the data that we do observe. And then expectation of a sum is sum of the expectation, right? And then expectation of an indicator function is the probability of the event in the indicator, exactly. Good. So sum of I is the probability that zi is equal to c given xi. And this, of course, is just gamma IC. So this is how we get n sub c. All right. Good. Good that everyone's nodding, because you know then otherwise I would just do it again next time. All right, so EM algorithm for GMM. I showed you this yesterday. It's an alternating algorithm where first we figure out the soft cluster assignments for each data point, and then we have these parameter estimate step. So very similar to maximum likelihood estimate for the regular Gaussian, but now, for example, for the mean, instead of just taking the mean of the points in cluster C, we don't know which points are in cluster C, so we take a weighted average where the weights are the probability that this ith point is in cluster C. Right. So this should seem plausible, but you shouldn't necessarily see why this is actually the maximum likelihood or helping us get the maximum likelihood, but it should at least seem plausible. Okay. All right, so here's an illustration. So we'll start with randomly chosen means and variances. This doesn't look random. These variances are close to spherical. Here are our data points. So we've initialized our parameters, and then the next step would be to find the soft assignment for every point to the two clusters, right? So for every point here, we find the probability that it belongs to this cluster and the probability it belongs to this cluster. And here we color code based on those probabilities. Dark blue is 1, dark red is this cluster 2, and things in between is some kind of mixture in probabilities. Clear? Yeah?
Are there situations where you're doing the assignment based on something other than distance?
So the assignment here is based on a probability.
Yeah, so I think I'm just confused about how that probability is.
Sure. That's easy. So basically, we have these two. Let's go back to the. So this is where we calculate that probability. So the probability, say we're looking at the ith point, xi, the probability that the ith point is in cluster J is, we look at the weight of each cluster and we calculate its Gaussian likelihood, and, well, this is the expression. So you can explicitly calculate the probabilities. Yeah? Yeah, you initialize all the parameters, pi's, mu's, and sigmas, yeah. Did you have something specific in mind for another way to do the soft assignments?
No, I'm thinking of other methods.
Okay, yeah. So you can use other distributions besides Gaussian. You could have a mixture of some other distribution. But- Okay. All right, so now we have our soft assignments, and now we have our parameter fitting, which is using that weighted average of the mean and then a weighted estimate of the covariance. And this gives us these adjusted means and covariance matrices, adjusted class-specific densities for the two clusters, right? And so on. And this is the EM algorithm converging to, so what do these circles represent? What have I drawn here? Yeah, these are like the covariance ellipses of each of the two Gaussian distributions. So you could think of it roughly as like maybe a 1 standard deviation contour of the Gaussian density, something like this. Okay. All right, yeah.
Question. So in previous graphs, next slide. So there are some dots that have colors that are not pure. So the color of that every dot basically represents the probability. Is that what you mean?
Well, the probability of being in blue versus red. So very blue is high probability of being in blue, very red is high probability of being red, and purple in the middle is kind of split.
I see.
Yeah.
Is probability of being in red, or it's probability of having been produced by the distribution?
The question is, well, what is being in, by being in red, what I mean is that it was in the generative process, it was generated by the distribution that's the red color. So yeah, it's certainly possible, but rare, that from this distribution, we would generate a point that's all the way over here. So we would not assign that to the red cluster, because that would be less likely, but it's possible to have come, so there could be errors, yeah. Yeah.
In this case, the pi i's were equal? Yeah. Or
Yes.
more or less.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think you're talking with relative probability, right?
So you have a probability distribution over assignment to the clusters. So there's no relative. It's the probability is always summed to 1.
Yeah, I mean the color.
The color you can.
The probability of being in the blue cluster versus the probability of being in the red cluster.
Yeah. So if you can imagine that these colors were generated by, you take, if the probability of being in blue was 30%, then we took 30% blue and 70% red and made the color.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
How is this expectation? I mean, if we say it as an expectation step, how?
I didn't say anything about expectation step yet. I mean, I did, but I didn't intend for it to be clear here.
So that means if the algorithm eventually converges, then we should see pure colors, right? So in that the dots are separated. But if not, so if it does not converge, then we still see those purple dots.
No, I don't necessarily say that. If a point lands here, it really is. It may not have a clear assignment to a cluster. So, no. So for a point to have just like almost all of its probability on just one cluster, you'd have to see that the likelihood of that point under the other clusters would have to be very, very small. For that to happen, we would need these covariance matrices to be the covariances to be very, very small. So if the covariances are very, very small, then yes, you will see more hard assignment of every point, like either to one or the other. And in fact, that's actually our next slide.
I see.
Yeah.
So the example that you give us right now is that actually, so soft margin actually, the result of this soft margin algorithm is the same as the hard margin algorithm.
No, I don't know about that.
Seems like they're perfectly separated in both sides.
Well, so first of all, this is an interesting point, that the Gaussian mixture model approach doesn't give you in the first presentation a hard classification at all. It gives you soft classifications. So now you're maybe suggesting you threshold it to make a hard classification, a hard clustering?
No, I just asked, like, is it just by coincidence that, you know, the graph that we see right now in next two slides, that we have fewer colors in both sides? Is that coincidence? How the data, is that?
Oh, good. I understand your question. Is it coincidence? I'm not sure. They are perfectly, the clusters are perfectly separate. That's a good question.
So it's not always hard the result of the end.
So the question is, I guess you're asking, do the probabilities always converge to like 0 or 1? Yeah. No. Okay. Okay. All right. But so EM for Gaussian mixture model seems a little like k-means, seems like what you are suggesting, and there is a precise correspondence. So first of all, in Gaussian mixture models, we're allowed to have clusters that are shaped in ways that are not circular. So we can have clusters that look like this, for example. Okay, k-means would never give clustering like this. Okay, so if we make in the Gaussian mixture model setting, however, if we fix our covariance matrices to be spherical, so not allowing stretched out covariances, and we have the variances going towards 0, so really tight Gaussians, then the probabilities of your cluster assignments do converge to 1 on the closest cluster in Euclidean sense, and 0 on the others, and then we do get a k-means algorithm pretty much exactly. Yeah. Okay, and that has to do with how the tails of the Gaussians decay. So if you're very far from the Gaussian center, or equivalently, if the variance is very small, then the likelihood for the cluster that you're closer to will be, in some sense, exponentially larger than the one that you're further away from. The ratio of them will be very large when those variances are very small. This is the type of thing that's very easy to try out in Python or something, and you can just see that your likelihood under two Gaussians, two different Gaussians, different means, say you're between but a little bit closer to one of them, and you look at the ratio of those likelihoods, and then you send those variances to 0, you'll see that the ratio gets very large. Someone check that and post to Piazza. Okay. Yes?
But this thing wouldn't have the limitation that k means that to get stuck in the local optima.
Yes. There's no magic in optimization. So it will be different, though. I mean, k-means, now that we have a nice correspondence, we can talk about the connection. So if we had Gaussian mixture model approach, and we restricted our models with this type of covariance, we could still get stuck in local minimum in our attempt to find the maximum likelihood of the Gaussian mixture model.
Still get stuck. I didn't understand like how we would still get stuck in this case, because we take a distribution and we are not, like the cluster center is not a single point. So we take a distribution. So
Okay, so I don't have off the top of my head an example of Gaussian mixture modeling where we get stuck in a local minimum, but it's an interesting question. So it is true that the likelihood function for Gaussian mixture model is not convex. And so in general, there will be local maxima. But I haven't thought about it before like this, so I don't know, let's think about it for 20 seconds. Anyone have an example? Can think of an example of where maximum likelihood gets stuck? Okay, that's enough. All right. Okay. Any more questions before we get into general EM algorithm? And if we don't finish, we can continue next week. But this is, I think it's pretty interesting. It's a little bit mathy, but it's not too bad. I hope you guys will follow along. Ready? All right. First, we have two or three little lemmas to review from math. First, you remember convex functions. Good. Jensen's inequality. Very fun. There aren't very many fundamental inequalities that come up so often in math. There's triangle inequality, Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, and Jensen's inequality are like the three top, and I rarely see much beyond that. There are, of course, but Jensen's is one of the top three. David's top three. Okay. So, Jensen's inequality. If you have a convex function, and x is a random variable, the expected value of f of x is greater than or equal to f of the expected value of x. Okay? All right, Wikipedia has a nice geometric proof of this. The way I remember it is, with this example, I know that ex squared, the expected value of x squared, is greater than or equal to the square of the expected value of x. How do I know that? How do I always remember that? Yeah, very good. So if I subtract x squared of the expectation of x from ex squared, I bring this over here, that's the variance of x. And I know variances are always greater than or equal to 0. This is how I remember the direction of Jensen's inequality. Okay. Oh, I see the answer was there. Okay. So that's Jensen's inequality. Now, KL divergence. Have you guys seen KL divergence before? Kullback-Leibler divergence? It's interesting. It's a way, in some sense, to measure how different two probability distributions are. Okay? So it's not quite a distance metric, but it gives you a measure of how different things are. So here's its definition. In the discrete case for discrete probability distributions, sum over every element in the support of the distribution, all possible values, and px log px over qx. It's a strange thing. There's ways to understand it, but it's the best way to kind of get it is to look at information theory. And I don't present it this year, but if you go to last year's slides, there's about 10 or 12 slides that's a very brief introduction to this field called information theory, where things like Kullback-Leibler divergence and entropy and mutual information all have very natural interpretations in terms of bits and coding up numbers and stuff like that. Okay. All right. And one thing to notice about KL divergence is that this is actually an expectation. See, we're summing. It's the expectation of log of px over qx with respect to the distribution p, where x is distributed as p. See how you can write, see how this is just an instance of the expectation? Okay. All right, so we have this Kullback-Leibler divergence, and there's just two really important properties of it that we're going to use. And this comes from what's called Gibbs inequality. And it simply says that the KL divergence between any two distributions is, first of all, non-negative. And second of all, it's equal to 0 only if the distributions are the same. So that's at least a very nice property of something that we claim to measure the difference, somehow differences between distributions. The KL divergence between two distributions is 0 if and only if it's the same distribution. And that's what we're going to need in a few slides. Okay. So it's not, don't confuse, don't think that it's actually a distance metric. It's not. It's in fact not even symmetric. So the KL divergence between P and Q is not in general the same as the difference from Q to P. All right. So the proof, I think we'll not go over it now, but it's worth walking through. There's only one inequality, which comes from Jensen's inequality. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
So it would detect actually any differences across two distributions if the means are not the same. It would detect that.
Can you say it again?
If the distributions don't have the same mean or variance, it would also detect that. It would take any differences essentially, or
You could take any distribution at all, two different distributions, and if they differ in mean and variance or anything, then yeah, the KL divergence will be greater than 0. Okay. All right. So the EM algorithm, we're going to look at it in terms of a general latent variable model. So a general model in which you only observe x but not z. So we're going to have z and x now. They can be more than just random variables. They can be vectors of random variables. But we'll still denote them as x and z. Okay. So we're going to parameterize the model by some unknown parameter theta. So in our Gaussian mixture model, theta would have been pi's and mu's and sigmas, but we'll just capture it all as theta to simplify notation a bit and to generalize it. This is just to say that this is not a Bayesian setting because we're conditioning on theta. This is really just, theta is just a parameter, and we write it this way because it's easier to write this way than with putting theta as a subscript on p or with a semicolon, which would be more traditional ways of writing it. All right. So x is called our incomplete data set because it's what we observe, but we imagine that there's also this z out there, which is unobserved. So x and z together is called the complete data set. X is called the incomplete data set. So we're, of course, after the maximizing the likelihood of the incomplete data set x, because that's what we observe. All right. So dB the data set, and all right. We want to find this marginal log likelihood. So this is the likelihood of x, right? Because we're summing out over z. That gives us the p of x, and this is for a single element. For the data set, there should be an extra product in here. All right. So the key idea of the EM algorithm is that even though this is hard to maximize directly, if we had the full data, if we only had to maximize the likelihood for the complete data, x and z, if that's easy, then the EM algorithm works well. Okay? So if we can maximize the complete log likelihood, then we're in good shape for EM algorithm, even if the marginal log likelihood is difficult. Now, for Gaussian mixture model, are we in that situation where if you get x and z, is it easy to find the maximum likelihood? Again? What would be the issue? Okay. So the sigma is to marginalize out the z. But if we observe z, we don't have to marginalize it out. Yeah. So I think we mentioned this yesterday. If you know the cluster assignment of every point, it's really easy to get the maximum likelihood parameter settings, right? We take all the points that are in cluster 1, we find their mean, we find their covariance. That is the maximum likelihood estimate for that Gaussian distribution, and so on for the other clusters. So if we have the full data for Gaussian mixture model, it's very easy to find the maximum likelihood estimates. Yeah. Okay. So this is the case for Gaussian mixture model. All right. But of course, we don't observe z. So the EM algorithm is based on this really interesting idea, which is, what if we had a probability distribution on z? We came up with a probability distribution on z, and then we tried to maximize the expected complete log likelihood. All right. So we come up with, somehow, we'll come to how later on, but somehow we come up with a distribution on this unobserved variable z, call it q of z. All right. And then we're looking for the expectation of the complete data log likelihood. We can compute the expectation of the complete log likelihood with respect to this distribution Q. Finding the, okay, is that clear? So that's what this expression is, finding the expectation of the complete log likelihood. Here's our complete log likelihood. We don't know z, so we're summing over all possible z's, and we're weighing it by the probability that Q gives to z. So this is the expectation of complete log likelihood with respect to Q. Questions on that? Okay. Sure.
How do we come up with the?
How do you come up with Q?
Yeah.
Any guesses? It should be a distribution on z that seems like a plausible distribution for z, given what we've observed about x. It's a pretty natural one, actually. You could think of it. All right, you had another question?
This is over all the x's over one single.
I only wrote one x and z. This I only wrote one. Yeah. Well, why did I only write one? It's because we're collapsing all x1 through xn into x, and z1 through zn into z. That's what's happening here. That's why there's only, it looks like one, because it is one, but it's an entire vector, right? That's to simplify. Okay? Any more? Okay. All right. So EM also assumes that this maximization is feasible. All right. So in EM algorithm, we don't know exactly how to maximize the marginal likelihood. So what we're going to do instead is maximize, we're going to find a lower bound on the likelihood and maximize that instead. So let's examine this marginal likelihood. This is the log likelihood. Expand it out. This is marginalizing out the joint. Fine, that's an equality. Let's multiply and divide by this Q of z. So just write it down, Q of z. We haven't even said what it is yet, except for it's a distribution on z. So no change, right? These cancel. But now, notice that this is an expectation with respect to qz, because we're summing over all values of z with this probability of z and some random expression. So we have a log of an expectation, so now we can use Jensen's inequality and swap it, right? So which way will the inequality go? It's hard. So the function is concave, not convex, so you have to switch it once. And then, so, okay. Yes, greater than or equal to. So we switch the expectation on the log, and we get this expression. And then we define this final expression to be LQ theta. We're going to be doing a lot with this LQ theta in the remaining slides. This is something called our variational lower bound on the marginal likelihood. Okay. So if in the future you ever study variational methods and you're like, I'm not sure what this is, come back to this slide, because the calculations in this slide is essentially the core of variational methods. EM algorithm is kind of the simplest introduction to variational methods. All right. So where we're headed here is in the EM algorithm. Our goal is we're going to maximize LQ theta. We're going to search over all probability distributions Q and all possible values of theta, and there's going to be some method to it, but essentially we're just going over this whole space of distributions Q and parameter settings theta, trying to get LQ of theta as big as we can. All right, that's the objective of the EM algorithm. And at the end, when we've gotten LQ theta as large as we can, we're going to take whatever theta it is, and we're going to say, this is our estimate of theta. That's going to be our best guess of the maximum likelihood estimate of theta. All right? So all of our effort is on finding a way to maximize L. And what we're going to show is that maximizing L does indeed help maximize this marginal likelihood. All right? And in fact, if we find the global maximum of L, that will also be the global maximum of the marginal likelihood. So that's good. That we can prove. Yeah?
So how is maximizing L, I mean, easier than log?
Oh, well, you'll see. But I mean, at the core is the fact that in here we have a joint, we have the complete likelihood, which is, we know it to be easier than the marginal. So we're not, notice we're not summing out over z in the middle. Okay, like here. Okay, so we're going to try to maximize L cubed theta. What we can do is take this expression and we split it into two pieces by breaking the log of this ratio into the log of the numerator minus the log of the denominator. And what you'll notice, what you should notice, is that the second term has no theta. All right? The first term has qn theta. Okay, so that's key. So the other thing to notice is that this expression is the expected complete data log likelihood. That's the thing that we assume is easy to maximize in the EM algorithm. All right, so if we maximize this expression over theta, we only have to look at this piece. If we maximize it over q, okay, both pieces are present. All right, so now we're going to show, we're going to look a little closer at how L lower bounds our marginal likelihood. So first of all, I want you to think of these things. I want you to think of LQ of theta. For fixed Q, for a fixed probability distribution, think of it as a function of theta. All right? And so for every theta, this bound holds. In fact, for any Q and every theta, this bound holds. So we can always write this down no matter what we plug in for Q and theta. So here's a picture. The red line is our, all right, so x-axis is theta. It's a cartoon version where our parameter space is just reals. So x-axis is our theta. The red plot is, that's the log marginal likelihood of our data for each theta, right? For every theta, we have a different likelihood. So if we knew the red line, the maximum likelihood theta is right here. Can you see? Because it's under the highest point of the marginal likelihood. So we would like to find this point. All right. Yeah. No. Okay. Now. Yeah. Well, red is the marginal likelihood. Yes, as I was going to say, this blue or purple line is LQ of theta for a fixed Q. Oh. So Q is fixed, and now it's a function of theta. And this is the plot of our lower bound as a function of theta. And yes, you're right. The green is for a different Q as a function of theta. So these are two different lower bounds for different probability distributions Q. So the method that we're aiming for here is we're going to kind of jiggle around Q, and for every Q, we're going to find the maximum theta for that Q. And then we're going to kind of go back and forth. All right. All right, so I gave you this big picture idea already. We have this inequality for all theta in Q, and we're going to, yes, so I said we're going to search over all Q and theta for maximizing L, and then take the corresponding theta as our estimate. So this can very well be a local maximum. This will typically, we hope to be a local maximum of our likelihood. You can't get much better with this type of algorithm. So if you want to try to find the global, you may need to restart with different initialization points. Okay. All right. So the question left is, all right, how exactly are we going to go about changing Q and theta to try to find the maximum value of LQ theta? All right. So we're going to use coordinate ascent, which we know about. Coordinate ascent, remember, is where we first take one of our parameters and hold the other one fixed and maximize our function with respect to that parameter. Then we fix that parameter and maximize with respect to the other parameter. And then are we done at that point? No, we have to iterate. That's not enough to do one. It's an iterative algorithm. You keep repeating. Okay. That's called coordinate ascent. All right. So here is EM algorithm at the high level. We start with an initial random point for theta. We maximize over distributions, which is an interesting thing, but we maximize over all probability distributions, LQ theta, and then we fix that Q star and maximize over theta, and repeat. So what we'll show is that the thetas give us monotonically increasing likelihood. So that's interesting. That's not necessarily obvious from here. So as we get a new theta in every round, certainly the lower bound keeps increasing. LQ star theta will keep increasing because all we do is keep stepping to a new point that's the maximum. So we can only be increasing LQ theta. What's interesting is that we also have increasing likelihood of theta. So the probability of x given theta is also increasing. All right. So here's an illustration of our algorithm. We start at theta old. Well, let's start with a Q. And start with theta old, apologies. Start with theta old. Now, we find a Q that gives the best lower bound at theta old. And that would be this. So the best lower bound at a point is basically any lower bound that is equal, if we could find one that's equal to the actual function at that point, that would be the best. You can't have a lower bound that's the best at this one point that's better than touching the graph. Right? You might find another lower bound that is tangent to the graph and is better in other places, but that's not the case here. Okay. All right, so we find our lower bound at theta old. Then we maximize this lower bound. So we go from here, and maximizing the lower bound brings us here to the peak of the purple curve, right? And that gets us to new theta, theta new. Okay, now we find a new Q that gives us a lower bound that's the best possible at this point. And that would be this green curve, which is tangent to the red line. All right. And repeat. Okay. All right. We have about 6 minutes left, so we have some time to make some progress still. So there's a very neat thing that happens if we examine this lower bound. So here's a definition of the lower bound. And we're going to split it in the log, but a little bit differently than we did before. Okay. So first we're going to split this joint distribution into conditional and marginal. Right? So that's just standard Bayes rule, or definition of conditional probability. Now we're going to split that log like this. So we keep these two terms in the first piece and move this to the second piece. All right. Now let's look at the second piece for a second. Do you see how this simplifies? Px given theta is independent of z, right? So we can move that outside of the sum. Now do you see how it simplifies? Yeah, the sum over z of qz is 1. So this term becomes log of px given theta. What's log of px given theta? That's what we're trying to maximize. That is exactly the marginal log likelihood of x. All right? So that's interesting. This is what we have the lower bound on. And now it's somehow related to our lower bound by inequality. So let's rearrange a bit. So the marginal likelihood is exactly equal to the lower bound plus this scale divergence piece. So this is an explicit expression telling us the gap between our marginal likelihood and our lower bound on it. It's exactly given by the scale divergence between Q and the marginal likelihood. It's pretty interesting, worth looking at for a minute. All right. Okay. All right. So we can use this to figure out how to find the best Q. Remember in our maximize Q step, we have the maximize Q step and the maximize theta step. This is going to help us with the maximize Q step. So here's our lower bound again, now with equality. We want to maximize this over Q. The second expression has no Q in it. So to maximize, we can ignore this. So now we're just maximizing this negative scale divergence. All right? Over all possible distributions Q. Okay. So what's the answer to this maximization problem then? Yeah? It would be? Yeah, right.
That too.
Yes, that's right. So the maximum, so first of all, let's remember that the KL divergence is greater than or equal to 0 and equals 0 only if its two pieces are equal. The two distributions are equal. All right? This is a negative KL divergence, which means it's always going to be negative or 0. So if we can make this 0, that's the maximum. How can we choose Q to make this 0? Very easy. Take Q equal to P of Z given X and theta old. This would have been what you could have guessed. And it's pretty natural, right? What's our best guess for Z? How about the conditional distribution of Z given what we observed, X? It's very natural. And here's the proof that that is the maximizer for fixed theta old. Okay. So, so now we have this equality. We have this, if we plug in Q star, then this is an equality. So is there something odd about this? It's a lower bound, and then I'm saying it's equal. Are we done? What's the gap here? So have we found, does this mean we can, so it's just an equality at one particular theta, at theta old. It's not an equality everywhere. It's equality at theta old. This expression was for a fixed theta. Okay, this equality was for a fixed theta. That's important. All right. Okay, but we do have always an inequality for all theta. So remember, L is always a lower bound for any Q and theta. So we have this inequality for all theta and an equality for the particular theta old. And now this explains our picture, right? So we have equality at theta old and an inequality everywhere else, right? Or less than or equal to everywhere else. When the lower bound touches what it's supposed to be a lower bound for, it's called a tight lower bound. It's tight at this point. All right. Cool. Any questions on this? All right. So now we can talk about our general EM algorithm. We alternate between maximizing Q and maximizing theta. The expectation step it's when we find this Q star, which is we just set Q star equal to this conditional distribution. And then we plug that Q star into our lower bound L. So L Q star over theta. And when we plug it in, this is an expectation, right? Because it's an expectation with respect to Q star. That's why it's called the expectation step. So finding this function, write it as a function of theta, which is what we want to maximize. It's an expectation, so kind of computing that function, that expectation, that's the expectation step. All right, so what's the next step? We've maximized over Q. That was the choice of Q star. And now we maximize over theta, right, with fixed Q star. So we want to maximize L Q star theta with fixed Q star. And we just call that J theta, so we just find the maximum of J theta over theta. That's the maximization step. All right. So there you have the EM algorithm. And we're out of time, but yeah.
What is L function of this shape?
Concave?
Yeah, like why is it concave?
That's a great question. I'll have to think about that. I want to say it's because of the log, but I don't want to even jump to that. All right, guys, so I'll see you on Wednesday. I'm flying back from somewhere on Wednesday, so if anything weird happens with the airplane, I will try to post to Piazza, but I should be here.